right, so let's jump into this a little bit. So like high level, this type of kind of hard wave style is pretty much based around it's just a nice bass line, nice Reese sounding bass line, good ambience effects, and then a kind of like glitchy or affected sounding vocal. And that's kind of the way I built that entire UEP. That was the aesthetic that I was going for in the breakdowns and the intros of the track. So that's really what you have in the intro. Yeah, I'm gonna there we go. Should be a little better. So yeah, percussion wise, very, next to nothing going on in the intro. Like, it's really just that Reese bass. And then let me break all this down. So all my stuff is kind of grouped by, types of instruments. And this is just like bussing and Logic, percussion, drums, all that kind of stuff. Things that are similar go to the same bus. So chords and stabs, I think I have a pad. I do have a pad in here. But if I take everything out except for the sub and bass, this is what you have. So yeah, very simple. Basically, there's a couple different layers here. Got a very basic Reese bass. So that's the basic Reese bass. This is just Serum, and I can go into gory detail on this, but I won't dive too deep on the patches because I want to kind of focus a little bit more on like high level production and mixing. But the patch is really simple. It's a saw on a sine wave. I don't even think there's like detune on this. I think what I did is I did the detune through the fine knob, and it's controlled with this macro. So that's how you're getting the resound, is through that fine knob detuning. And when you detune the opposite ways, you kind of have that Reese sound. So there's a bunch of different ways to do Reese bass. That's how I did this one. The next layer is this guy. So this is kind of like more of that upper mid, not upper mid, but it's like high, low mid type of, like just straight mid almost, Reese layer. So that first layer is kind of like the body. This is kind of like the, I wouldn't call it the bite, but it's kind of just like that mid layer. It kind of gives it a little bit more presence. And then this is kind of the unique layer that makes it sound cool. And then this is just an M1 patch. I freaking love this M1. I used it a ton in this EP. Used it in like a bunch of piano sounds and stuff. This one, I think I just found some patch and then muted like one or two things. I think I just muted one thing out of it and just used it probably pretty much as is. I think I just took a lot of the effects out. I tend to take a lot of the effects out of the M1 patches because they're kind of overdone sometimes. But all right, and then mixing it, if we look at all three together, so that's EQ for that first layer, second layer, and then third layer. So we'll look at it like this. Okay, so we got that low mid layer here. We've got the mid layer, which is kind of like the bite almost. Then we have this unique layer. You can see that like the low mid, I kind of rebalanced a bit and shelved that low down. I think that was just to get it to sit better in the mix. And then with this one, I actually have a bit more content down here in the 100, 200 hertz area than I would probably leave now. So that's actually a little bit more down there than, like if I mixed it now, I'd probably mix that a little differently. Like I'd probably go a little bit more like that compared to that. So that works. I mean, the way it sits right now, I think I was looking for something a little bit warmer, which is why I left it like that. But I think for the style that I've been doing recently, my taste, I kind of like things that are a little bit colder sounding. So I may have kind of shelved this up a little bit more. I might have actually gone this way, but yeah. So that's just kind of how those all fit together. And you can see for that bottom layer, I definitely cut out a lot of the highs so that it made room for the other two layers. So that's just pretty basic EQing there to get those all three to fit. Other than that, I just have, you know, some Saturn, OTT, like OG Saturn shit. Simplon. I don't even use these plugins anymore, honestly. Like Saturn and Simplon, I use different plugins to achieve the same stuff now, but they work great. This, if you guys don't use Logic, this is just kind of like a multi plugin with distortion, filtering, compression, all that kind of stuff. But it's based on the camel fat distortion stuff. So it's like, if you're familiar with those camel fat old camel fat distortion plugin, that's basically what this is based around. So that's how I get a little bit more meat out of it. Like if I go here, so it's just kind of compressing it, giving a little bit more apparent loudness, and then also I did some filtering to take some of that high end away, just to clean it up a bit more. A lot of these plugins are kind of redundant, to be honest. I probably could have gotten away with doing, you know, a fewer plugins, but my workflow for these, especially if I'm in like a state of flow and I'm being more creative, is I'll just kind of I'll carve something out, and then when I'm like, maybe I'll come back to it 20 minutes later, like, oh, it needs a little bit more, I'll just add another plugin on top of it instead of changing what I already did. That isn't always the best workflow, but it's just sometimes what I do when I'm like trying to be super creative and not mess up my flow. For this guy, I actually had decap on here. This is something I would use more now. I really love this plugin. Let's see, turn it on and off. Without it. With it. And like I said, this layer is supposed to be kind of like that bite layer. So it's not really bite in the sense of like that high mid like you would normally think of a bite, but it gives it a little bit more attitude, and so I wanted to give it some more aggression in those mids, and that's what this decap does. Fat effects, you'll see this on a lot of my channel strips because it's just kind of an all-in-one. I can do a lot of things really quickly with it. So I'm just doing some band passing, more just cutting out those lows to make sure there's no, you know, phasing issues, or frequency masking, I should say. Compression, and then just cranking it up into the compressor to, you know, squash it pretty much. And then this top layer, a lot of the same stuff. So actually, I have this chorus on here, and when I turn the chorus on and off, you'll notice it actually, it almost sounds better with the chorus off. What I was saying with this chorus effect is, it like, if you listen to it soloed with and without the chorus effect, it actually sounds a little bit kind of better almost without the chorus. Definitely sharper, but something I was going for this was I wanted to push it a little bit further back into the mix. So it's pretty subtle, and the reason I wanted to push that back in the mix is you've also got to remember I have vocals in this part, so that's a way for me to make a little bit more space with the vocals, and it's less of like frequency masking issues and more of just 3D space in the mix. So kind of pushing that upper mid layer of the bass kind of spatially back and not frequency wise back, if that makes sense. So it's kind of approaching a mix from a more 3D sense instead of just that 2D, like, oh, these frequencies overlap. So that's the idea behind why I have that chorus there. Again, bad effects on here. So that's the bass. And I usually would route a different subline that's split off from this, but I actually liked this sort of phasey sub that was in the bottom layer, so I just kept it like that. All right, now we have the bass effects. What's going on here? This is kind of builds a lot of the ambience. So that's a cool little like ambience layer, just kind of gives you a bit more context of the mood of the track and where it's going. For me, when I'm writing stuff, ambience, bass line, and like drums are like probably the big, and chords, probably the big elements that I focus on. I have to have some kind of ambience in order for me to kind of set the mood right to write anything pretty much. So normally I find myself writing chords, and ambience is like the first things that I'll touch in a song or in a production. But with the bass, up here, you just got various different things. I don't know exactly what this was. I think this was some ambience thing that I found on Splice and then distorted the hell out of it, and then kind of cut it to audio and just chopped it little elements. So I think that's what this was, and you can see it's kind of repeating in certain sections here. And then I'm opening up a filter over time on it. So that's what's going on there. This is one of these, like a rain layer, and some of these are just kind of like Foley, like stage effects, pretty much like grains and stuff like that. So it's all just little textural elements that kind of help push things. And then this layer, I have a bit crusher on it, and that just makes it sound a little bit more digital. So gives it a little bit more of a lo-fi feel. Just kind of darkens it up a bit. Fits the overall mood I was looking for. So that's the ambience. And then you got vocals, getting here. All right. So this was the original phrase, it looks like. And the processing I have on here, just some EQ, a few altar boys. And this is just based on some automation. Like I normally will run one altar boy just to get the tone right. So I'll mess with the format, and I'll shift that around to get the tone where I would like it. And then I'll run another altar boy, and I'll automate the pitch knob to do like octaves and stuff. So there you go, back. There we go. So in the intro, let's see. Yeah, and I'm just kind of jumping around between different octaves on that second altar boy. And that's just basically automating this dry wet here. And then there's some other stuff going on later on. There's a filter that's opening up. So it starts out pretty low filtered and then comes up. And that's what was originally here. And I bounced it to this track, which then did some little bit more processing. And the processing I did here was some so Logic has this thing called remix effects, and it's kind of like a glitch effects plugin where it just does like little cuts, like vinyl stops, bit crushing, and also repeats and stuff like that. I normally don't use this. This was a rare occasion. I think I was just experimenting with it. I normally would just cut to audio and then do all that myself manually, but in this case I just felt like doing it because they have XY pads and you can kind of play it in live, and that's I think what I did here. So yeah, this is just the XY pads kind of, so you can hear the little stutter there. So that's what this is the plugin that's doing that. You normally do it in audio though. Snap heap, I don't really know what this is doing, to be honest. Let's see. Sounds like it sounds like not a lot. It's probably just, I mean, you got a little bit of drive, and then it just sounds like a little bit of delay effects. 3/16 is kind of a nice sound, but it's just giving a little bit of parent volume too. So there's not much going on with that. Vintage verb just to give it some space, and then of course the fat effects to kind of finish it off. I think the interesting thing here is these other layers I'm doing. So that actually sounds like I printed the snap heap delay out to audio and then just affected it separately, and then threw another effects on, or another echo on it. Did a little bandpass filter, kind of, or a phone type style filter, and some fat effects to, you know, glue it all together. And so that's that. Now this guy is the interesting kind of textural layer that I have going on with the vocals. So this is not, so it says the vocal phrase, but I remember the processing I did this, it actually comes from here. This is where, this is bounced to audio from this track. And this track, I took the same vocals that I had before up here, the same vocals that are in, you know, the main part, the When I Met You, and I put a crystallizer on it. And basically this is just kind of giving that weird glitchy kind of crystal type, you know, style of sound. And just did a bunch of processing. You know, I got some reverb, some compression, and then some filtering. Bounced out to audio, and then I cut some pieces up to try and like have them create a cool little phrase, basically. And then you put that all together. And if you were to take it out, so just kind of adds a nice, like I said, nice texture element to go with the vocals. And since it's based on the vocal, it kind of lives in the same space, so it all works together. Lead wise, we have just some plucks. I'm not sure where these came from, to be honest. See what they sound like. So I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, this was, I think, one of these leads, one of these rave leads that I had just a simple kind of sustained note melody, bounced it to audio, and then just did a bunch of repeating and chopping in audio. And you can see like the repeat loops here, and they just kind of do stuff. So I just basically chopped and screwed it, and that's what that is. I also have an LFO tool that I think comes in later for like a gating effect, and then just a bunch of EQing. Nothing crazy there. So this has just got some more crystallizer. Crystallizer is really good for that like digital ethereal sound. Without it, it sounds like this. So this is a basic, it's a Logic plugin. It's really good for making kind of like digital bell tone sounds, and slightly like almost like a digital organic combo of how the textures sound and a lot of this stuff. So I rarely use it, but for this, it was just, I was looking for something kind of funky sounding, and it just worked really well. And then that's just a little 3-note trill, or, you know, a little trill there to do that. Crystallizer just kind of adds the cherry on top. There it is. And then that's pretty much all that's going on there. There is a pad, but it's just basically following the bass, and I think it's got a 7th above it, or a perfect 5th, sorry, no, it's just octaves. I'm actually just running octaves, and those are mirroring the bass line. And that pad sounds like this. My bad. And that's just some like basic saw pad in Alchemy. Yeah, classic simple pad. Really simple. Just giving it a little bit more meat. Coming into it. Alright, now the big element that I introduce here, there's a couple things that I introduce, but the main element is this art. This is another Alchemy preset, and I think I'm just actually going through this performance pad to kind of change the tone throughout over time. Alchemy is dope. I think so Alchemy is free for me. I wouldn't have bought the plugin. It comes with Logic. It used to be sold separate. It was owned by Camel Audio, I think, but Apple bought, or Logic bought Camel Audio a couple years ago, and then they wrapped all their plugins into the Logic bundle. So now you can only get it through Logic. But I like the sound banks in there. There's some really cool stuff. It does take a little bit of tweaking to get it to sound like cool, I think, in modern sounds, but there's a pretty good variety of stuff in there. My favorite thing about it is the performance pad, because you can literally load up a preset, and the performance pad changes a ton of the tonality, and it's really fun to kind of get these evolving sounds very easily into your production. So like, so yeah, it's kind of like messing up because I already have automation on it, but that's basically what's going on there. And like, yeah, like I said, I'll load it up and I'll just play around the pad until I find something that sounds cool, and then just draw in the automation. Then it's just, let's see, looks like probably doing some filtering. Yep, just filtering up. There was one other thing that I introduced. Oh yeah, this one. So we got this guy here. So the pad from the intro is still there, but now you have this little chord melody. So progression's following the same as the bass, but now we have these little there's basically this little melody that's interspersed between the chords, and I do this a lot in my productions. It kind of adds some dynamic element to the chords, instead of just having, you know, sustained chords on every downbeat of where the bass is hitting. It just kind of gives a little bit more movement. Yeah, I mean, that's some basic triad stuff. Yeah, I mean, those chords are very simple. There's really nothing crazy going on there. Oh, and for those that are, if you don't know, if you check, so in Logic, if you're using Logic and you select a bunch of chords, or like a bunch of notes at once, and you look in the top left up here, it'll actually tell you what chord that is. It'll give its best guess. It's not always right. In this case, it's really just, you know, perfect fifth stack, or it's a unison stack with perfect fifth thrown in there. So it's just an A5 is what they call it. But over here you have a G sus2, and that's more or less right, I think. I'm not like really that good with music theory. I know a little bit, but so sometimes when I'm writing chords, I'll actually use that on the top left, this area over here, and I can write a chord progression without even hearing it, and I know it'll sound mostly okay, just because I know what shapes sound decent and what kind of builds suspense and what doesn't, kind of builds tension and what, you know, releases it, just from doing it so much. A lot of times if I'm doing a 4-chord progression, my 3rd chord or my 4th chord, depending on how I want it, will have a lot of tension. So I normally like to do 3rd chord will have tension, and then 4th chord resolves a bit, and then it returns back into the 1 chord. Sometimes I'll do the fourth chord, has a lot of tension, and resolve into the one, but it just really depends on the song. So in this case, I've got some tension with that sus2. I think this is actually also a sus2. So in this case, I didn't really resolve much here. But it kind of resolves into the one after that. That's kind of what's going on there. Again, still pretty basic stuff. And in terms of chord theory, these songs, especially on the UEP, are very basic. Like, I didn't go crazy into the theory for all this. I wanted to just focus more on sound design and structuring an atmosphere that was really cool. So that was where a lot of the effort was posted. Percussion in this section is pretty basic, I think. I've got so just got this impact just layered with a couple different things. Virtual Riot has some of the best impacts in the game, but I don't like to just use Virtual Riot impacts, even though it probably would have just done well just to use that here, just because they're very recognizable. So I normally will layer it in with like other lesser known impacts or lesser known sample pack stuff, just to kind of give it something, my own flair that I think is like more unique to me. Because you'll hear, I mean, it's a meme now in the producer community, like Virtual Riot impacts are everywhere. So that's kind of why I layered. It's one of the main reasons I layered that with the Xylent and the other impact noise. Also just kind of hits a little harder. Like if I were to take this out. Right, like that works for that section, but that just kind of like gives it a bit more of a sting. And I'll say like high level, it's things like that, like little details like that, that'll make your production stand out from other people. Anyone can just throw a sample in there or a loop in there and make something that sounds pretty cool. But it's like your decisions of what you layer with what, or how you use that sample, and like in the context you use it, that's what makes your stuff sound unique in my opinion. And then some breakbeat stuff. So yeah, I always like to chop up my breakbeats or like do like little loop patterns and stuff like that. So yeah, and that's just filtering out. I don't have this plugin anymore, this sound shifter plugin. So it's basically just pitching it up. That's all it's doing. I use other plugins for it now, but so that's the only thing that's missing here. That's what's going on there. And then drum wise, I think there's like some kicks and stuff layered in here. Yeah, so I've got some claps. So it's very basic EDM buildup. Yeah, so nothing crazy, just little trills on these snares as they go up. So something a little bit different than just like doubling and then like quadrupling the pattern. Like you give it a little bit of a trill here and there, just to make it a little bit more unique, but nothing advanced really in my opinion. And then I usually like to introduce the lead, you know, the main drop lead. So that's what's going on here, I think. Yeah. Okay, so I'll go into the drop lead and how I mix that, because as you can see, there's a shit ton of layers for this drop lead. Probably too many, honestly. But I was very much experimenting with like this sound and how I could get it as thick and as blown out as possible. That's why I kind of have so many layers, but I think I might have overdone it now that I look back on it, but we'll look at that in just a second. I think that's about it. Just a couple risers in there. I mentioned before in my NCS breakdown video, I like to layer risers. I think it just adds a little bit more hype. The drums for this drop are super simple, as are like a lot of the hard wave stuff. All right, so yeah, here's that drop lead. So it's pretty thick. But one thing you'll notice, I'll just put high level before I go into like the individual layers. You'll notice if you look at this analyzer right here that you can't see shit. Okay, hold on one second. Let me add that in because I think it's important to see this. There we go. Okay. So this guy, will that disappear? Perfectly disappears. Then come back. Let's booty. There we go. Okay, so this is just a frequency analyzer or a multimeter basically, but you'll see that you got frequency along the bottom. You'll see where this lead sits. All the layers together, it still sits pretty tight in the mid-range. So the exception of a little like a fill here or there, it's pretty much, you know, 400, 500 up to like 8, 9K. Very tight and very present in the mid-range, but not a lot going like outside of that range basically. That gives the bass, your low mid bass, and also your sub a lot of room to breathe. And it also gives your highs, so like, you know, the cymbals and all that stuff in your percussion to cut through the mix very clearly. And also if you have any vocal chops or anything like that, the sibilance on the top end of the vocal is going to cut through as well. So it's not battling with anything. And if you want even some more energy, you can throw on a white noise layer that follows the lead line on top of that, which I don't think I did with this one, not explicitly at least. But that's the idea with this lead, and that's how I mixed all the songs on the UEP. Is they're very, very tight in the mid range, and not really, you know, leaking out of that. So yeah, disappear that. All right, first layer. Let's look at this bad boy. So this first layer is a silence patch that you cannot see that window. I just realized that. Hold up, let me do something real quick that's gonna make this easier. Display capture. There we go. That's better. Now you can see everything. Don't move. What do they just do? All right, first layer is the silence patch. It's, I guess, was a patch, a preset, I don't know, but I definitely changed it up. Just a square wave detune, saw wave detune, that's it. Probably just some stacks with other saw waves, yeah. Multiple voices and some EQing. Very simple on the patch. OTT and some EQing. And then again, fat effects for that extra compression. There's this grit module, which is just a distortion, and it kind of adds a little bit of like, not bit crush, but kind of like dirt on the top of the high frequencies. So that's that layer. This layer, Vital. I think this was started as a preset. No, this one I did myself. So saw wave stack, nothing crazy. I think I have, where is this going to? Yeah, phase center. So this is just kind of muddying up, or I think, let's see what it does. So yeah, again, this isn't anything really crazy. I think the big sound is really coming from this reverb, it sounds like. Yeah, which is at 52 mix, 5.5 seconds. Now the way it sounds so tight though when it cuts off is I'm automating the mute of the full track volume. So when that cuts, automate the mute or completely mute the track out. So it sounds big when it's on and then completely cuts out. You know, there's no reverb tail essentially when I'm done with those notes. So that's how I'm doing that. Pretty common trick. That's it for the Vital patch. Like I said, I mean, I'm not gonna go deep in on it, but that's that layer. Okay, so the mentality behind these three layers, this is kind of like that front center lead layer. This is what's gonna cut through the mix, and it's gonna work pretty well in mono. These first two layers, the first layer is not going to work that bad in mono. It'll work, but the second layer is going to basically almost disappear because it's so reverbed out. so you're gonna have a lot of problems in mono, but in stereo it sounds really big. So that's why I have that. This one, so that it cuts through on mono. And this is a serum patch. Again, probably just like a noise saw or something. Yeah, so just some noise in there and a couple saw waves. Nothing crazy. And with some detune. This guy. So this is a preset. Yeah, not a whole lot to say here. I think it just has this chorus is what's giving it that weird metallic sound, I think. So that kind of gives a little bit of character. This is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Now, what I did here is these, I don't remember which ones, but they're some of one of these layers that I like basically coded, just put on a ton of reverb, and because I like the character of the layer, but I wanted it to be like really controlled with the space. So I just layered a bunch of reverb on it, made it 100% wet, and then bounced it to audio, and I cut out the tails so that I can like have a lot of control. And then I'm doing like decap, some chorus, and all that kind of stuff, and then EQing the hell out of the out of this to get it to fit with the salt with the other layers just right. And then I have another ambience layer. So what those are really doing is, especially if you're wearing headphones, you hear it. Those are kind of like on the sides, they're adding a lot more kind of, I don't know, it's almost like enveloping you more instead of just kind of being there and big sounding. It kind of is more enveloping. So that's what that's really doing. If you put it this in mono, they're going away, like they're disappearing. That's just kind of stereo ear candy. So that was the point of that. Let's see. And then I just have some fills. This was probably bounced from some instrument that I deleted already. It was probably like a serum patch that I just did some like distorted saw, like growl or something like that. That's what this fill is right here. So nothing crazy there. That's it for the lead. And then I have some saws that are layered in there, it looks like. So a bit more chord action on this. These are just copies of the same chord progression. Again, this is what I was saying earlier, where I like that third chord in the progression, or I guess this in this case is the fourth chord, to be to have a lot of tension so that it resolves into the one chord in this case. So essentially it's a 4-chord progression. You just have a little bit of a modulation between, you know, or within the second chord and then also within the fourth chord. Not modulation, but just kind of like it just changes up a bit, like just one of the voices changes a little bit. So here in that fourth chord, I do this dissonant thing, which I don't know what kind of chord that is. But you can hear how it just kind of drops in and then like adds tension and then resolves. So that's what's going on there. Pretty basic saws, silence patch, another silence patch. Normally my saws are silent. Sometimes I'll throw on a serum layer, but normally that's what I do. But you'll notice that compared to the leads, I mix my saws. My super saws are very quiet compared to the leads, especially like if you're thinking of future bass. Normally in future bass or like melodic bass, your super saws are way louder relative to the leads. For this style, I wanted the leads to shine, and when you mix the saws louder, they tend to brighten up the whole track. So, you know, I brought them quite a bit down. They're really just there to thicken up the support that the bass is already giving. So it's just giving a little bit more harmonic texture and also just a little bit of like cushion essentially. That's without them. It's very, very slight. I mean, it's even kind of hard to hear in the headphones. I can still hear it, but it adds just a little bit. It's like 5% maybe extra energy, and that's it. Like, it's just a small fix. And I mix that intentionally like that because I'm trying to, especially with this genre, I was trying to move away from having any super saws. And I think 𝖋𝖔𝖚 doesn't even have super saws in the drop, if I remember correctly. But this one I felt like needed a little bit more energy in the drop, so that's why I have those there. And this, just basically a low mid respace. I'm pumping up the low mids quite a bit, as you can see, and also just like the lows in general. Cutting some room for the sub, so that's what's going on there. This is some flume, you know, singular bass patch. And then, yeah, nothing crazy going on there. I don't even think I really edited the patch much. Throwing some decap on there. Got some Saturn, a bunch of EQ, and then fat effects. So that's what's going on there. And if you hear that, and without the mid layer, so a lot of the stuff I'm doing now, I would turn this down quite a bit. But with this style, I wanted that, like, that girthy low end, like really kind of fat. So I wanted, it kind of almost resembles like an analog bass. So that's why I mixed this so loud, this low mid bass. I normally would mix it way quieter. Like, if you listen to guys like, especially in dubstep, like Virtual Riot, guys like that, or like even 𝖉𝖉, their low mid basses are a lot lower relative to everything else in the mix. So, but that was an intentional choice here just for the style that I was doing. So that's that. Barely any effects going on here. We have some like white noise splashes, a riser to get us out of the drop. I normally like to do that. We bring the vocals back here, which, how does that sound? I don't quite remember. No. So same trick I did already a couple times, right? Like, bounce this, like code it in reverb essentially, bounce it to audio, and then that's what you have here is the verb track. I have more control of it this way. Basically, I can, you know, I can even do like reverse, like I can reverse the reverb or something, right? And it just kind of adds a little bit more of a glitchy element. You can chop it up and make it sound cool. That's what's going on there. This is some, yeah, it's another crystallizer layer. Kind of gives it a little bit more sheen. Like I said, percussion's not really going to do anything crazy. That's pretty much it for the drop. For the drop one, at least. Okay, so big thing change here is a bit of a new, it's not really new, but it's kind of a play on the original ARP. So we've got this, basically an add9, which when I do my ARPs, I like to write them as chords that sound cool before I even try to ARP it, and then I will run it through an arpeggio, or arpeggiator. Sometimes I'll use Logic's arpeggiator. In this case, I used 𝖋𝖚𝖚, like built-in one, just because it had a cool patch. And then same thing like I did before, I'm just kind of over time will be opening up these filters and changing the tonality of the sound. But big thing for ARPs for me, there's two main ways I'll write them. One is like having a cool chord sound or progression or whatever. So like I like add9s and like sus chords. I think they sound really cool in ARPs. So that's what I did here. You know, I just got this A minor add9. And then later you'll see I do like some kind of it's almost like, think of it as like an ascending bass line. It's actually a static bass line, but then I have the top voices ascending. So just kind of creates that rising feeling in the build. But yeah, the other way I would do ARPs, which I don't do it that way in this song, is just kind of like draw it in basically. Still kind of based on chord structures, but a little bit more free form, and it's almost more like a lead pretty much. And that's kind of like the way that I've seen like 𝖃𝐻𝑆ara and guys like that. They'll do their ARPs more like that. It's kind of more of a trancey style ARP. And I was talking about the wrong ARP altogether, but that's what this guy is right here. So that's the climb, and this half the song that where it builds. That's what I'm talking about climbing here. But as you can see, it just keeps going. Like static octave, it looks like. No, it's a fifth. Uh-oh. No. But it would be like the first note and second note in a triad, I think. No, it wouldn't. Okay, I don't know. But basically, I like that that interval, so I kept those the same, and then I just kept climbing on the top voice. So that's what happened there. But the ARP I was actually trying to talk about was, where is it? This right here, I think. Yeah, this is what I wanted to talk about. Okay. I'm fairly sure it comes from this. Let's see. Yep. So again, just cool little like art pattern I made. Bounce it to audio, and then I just did a bunch of effects. And I think, so what I did is I probably bounced 2 of these, it sounds like. Bounce this and then an octave higher. And then once that's done, you had an audio, and it sausaged the fuck out because I like things loud, but it also just kind of sounds cool. But so that's done with, this is just in reverse, and then I just fade it up. So that's how that's done. So yeah, that's all that is. I just chopped part of this and then reversed it. So that's what that is. As you can tell, there's a ton of EQ on this because I could not get this to sit right. This is something I think I like have a band that I like mess with, or like later in the drop or something. But that's basically what's going on there. And then I have some gain. I also automate that later to help it fit in the mix some more. So yeah, that was just a lot of like surgical kind of playing around with the EQ to get it to fit right in the mix, because there's a lot of like ARP stuff going on in this part of the song. And then there is these 2 guys. With the pad. That's just a top line. You know, I just did that by ear. I was like, oh, it sounds cool over the chords. And so that just kind of helps the melody, that a verse melody that drives it forward. So instead of just listening to a progression, you've got some kind of dynamic thing that's driving it forward altogether. Percussion, very minimal. I've got a little like few impacts and stuff that just kind of push it a little bit, but really not a lot going on there. Breakbeat comes in. It's the same loop before. Some of these, you'll hear some of these chops and stuff. This is merged, but basically the original loop that I had, chopped it up. Like this part right here, I would just like copy that snare hit, and I'll just loop it real quick so that it had that glitchy kind of sampled loop sound. So it's like, and then the only other trick really that's going on here besides just doing more of that cutting and chopping is this hit right here. That this kind of right here almost sounds like a flam, where they like that. It's actually just a snare that I just time stretched out, and it just, normally when you time stretch a snare, depending on the algorithm you use, it'll make it almost sound like a flam effect, like you're hitting, you know, like a really double hit almost, or like quickly in succession hit on the snare. So it just kind of sounds cool, but it also gives it a bit more of a digital, you know, downsampled sound. That's kind of why I did that. And then, yeah, you just got a little quick reverse in there on that loop. So that's just kind of a detail thing, you know, you just take 5-10 minutes, chop it up, and make it sound cool, and it just gives a little bit more character to it. All right, so then this is an orchestral loop I made a long time ago that I just use when I think it, like I just have it in my loop library that I use every now and then. And I just have it in here. It just worked. I don't know what the original BPM of the loop that I made was. I think it was like 180 or something. So you can tell it sounds like time stretched, but in context it works. So and it's just pushing up like that. So yeah, ARP's climbing, doing all its thing. All right, let's see. Let's look at the lead, and then we're gonna jump into that master. I don't even know what the mastering project for this looks like. It's been so long. All right, so we've got this. Okay, so that is actually supporting the main lead. Is this vocal thing? Yeah, this is the main lead. Collapse that. Okay, so it's basically like vocal chops, and I like 50-50 will do vocal chops like this, where I take a phrase and then just chop it up. Like I'll just take syllables, chop it up, and do it all on the track, kind of like this. The other 50% of the time I'll do it and I'll put the whole audio file in a sampler, let it chop it up like automatically by transients, and then just kind of play it on the keyboard, which is normally how I come up with my vocal chops, just because it's a bit more intuitive for me. I can play it more like an instrument. And also leads to more happy accidents, because you just kind of like, you know, play around with it and you don't really know what you're going to get. And then until you hear something that's like catches your ear and you kind of dive down that rabbit hole. With this, I knew I wanted something that was very close to the phrase, and just kind of let that phrase play over the D and B drop. I mean, the drums in this section are drum and bass. So the leads and the bass are just all supporting, kind of creating an atmosphere. The drums are pushing it along. And then this is just kind of like the main motif lead, you know, when I met you, all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to chop it up and make it a little bit more chopped and screwed sounding. So that's why I did it this way instead of doing the syllable way or like the sample way. So this is really just a lot of experimentation. Like I'll you know, we'll listen to it and say, okay, you know what, I kind of want to chop it at this word, because like on the wood part, the vocalist is holding out wood, like they hold it out for an extra note, and it kind of has a nice long sustained note to it. So there's a lot you can do with that when you're chopping vocals up. If it's a quick consonant sound, and it's held out or something like that, it just doesn't really work as well for chopping. If you're looking for something percussive, you want to chop on a consonant. If you want something more melodic, you chop on a vowel. So with this, you know, she's holding out the wood, you have the OU sound, and ooh sounds really good for chopping. So that's why I decided to chop at that word. And then in terms of normally what I'll do is when I'm chopping, I'll just chop like the syllable I like, and then I'll automatically loop it just because, and I'll just hear what happens. Usually you can look at the audio file and kind of tell what's going to happen. You can see how it, the overall envelope or like the overall shape of the audio file is it kind of bends out and then comes a little bit back down and then back up like that. So you know it's going to have to, it's going to, dynamics wise, it's going to be like, whoa, like that. And when you loop it, it's going to have a cool like cut effect. And it's going to sound very obviously looped. And that's kind of what I was looking for. It sounds like, you know, a 90s breakbeat loop type thing, which is the vibe for this track. So that's a lot of the style of chopping that I did here. And then I would chop different little words here and just reverse them. Kind of adds. So this is just kind of different things that I took and then reversed every now and then. So this one, if I didn't reverse it, it would sound like this. And then just churn it like that. Again, a lot of that's just experimentation. There's also underneath all of the chops and screws. So the way I'm writing this is I'll go through, I'll chop and screw it, make it sound cool, come up with that phrase, and then I'll start automating stuff to give it even more texture and movement. So in this case, I'm doing that with little altar boy, and I think it's the format. Yep. So I'm just kind of ping-ponging the format up and down. It just gives it a little bit more movement throughout the entire drop, or that part of the drop. And that's something else here is like, I like the story weave, or that weave cut. I like the way it sounded when it looped, and I thought it'd be cool to kind of indicate to the listener that this section is starting to come to a close by like looping that weave, because normally people are like, especially in EDM, you're trained to know that when things loop for a long time, you're kind of expecting it to double in time, and then it almost feels like a build essentially, especially in this genre. So that's what I'm playing off of, that expectation here, because I know I got to transition into basically a repeat of drop one. And so in order to do that, I repeat this loop thing. So I could easily take that out and the song would still work, but it wouldn't have as much of a tension building element in this part of the drop to lead us into the second half of the drop. So that's really the whole reason for putting that in there. And then it drops into basically the same as drop one. So yeah, that's the idea there. It's just something I wanted to bring up, because you got to think, even while you're in the drop, you got to think about how you build tension and then have a release even in the middle of your drop. Like a lot of people will think, how do I build as much tension as possible in the build and then release it on the downbeat of the drop or whatever, right? And then what they forget is halfway through the drop, like, and then you have a 32 bar drop and halfway through your listener gets bored because you're just looping it. So this is where you kind of do these little tricks here and there to keep people engaged throughout the whole drop and keep it sounding dynamic and fresh and all that kind of stuff. So that is something I wanted to point out. Chords, I'll just look at this real quick. I don't know what I'm doing here actually. So more or less same chord stack as drop one. I think these are a bit more up forward now, especially since we had this layer. So the chords are a bit more prominent in this part of the drop, because you don't have as many lead stacks as you did or as I did in the other drop. Like here, I've got all these leads in this part of the drop. Here, all I have is this vocal lead basically, and a little bit of supporting stuff, but it's not going to be as much high energy. So I had to make up some of that energy and some of that space on the chords on this part. So this one has a bit more of a future bass style, like processing sound to it. But then the drums are like D&B, which is kind of unique sounding. Yeah, so that's it. I mean, bass is doing nothing special. I mean, there's not even any octave jumping or anything. It's very, very simple. Main complexity is kind of like laying out this lead line and figuring out how it works in context for the rest of the song. So that's that. Now, I think I'm going to jump into the master, because high level, let's see if there's anything I can show on the mix that you guys haven't seen yet. I mean, you guys have seen the individual components. Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll show some of my bus mixing real quick, because this is part of mastering, the way that I treat it. I try to get the mix as tight and controlled as possible before going to mastering. And a good example of that is you'll see some of my mix downs here. Let's see, let's do this real quick. Mix down 4. Okay. So often what I'll do is, this is my first mix down. So this is like a first pass of the mix. I'll mix it down. And then as you can see, first of all, there's like plenty of headroom. So I'm making sure that I'm not clipping. Obviously, if you do it in 32-bit, you can clip and you'll be fine. I just still work in 24-bit just because I don't, just smaller file sizes, and I can just leave headroom in, I'm fine. So it's not a problem. But the big thing you'll notice here is like, what's called the what's it called, the peak to, I can't remember what it's called, I'm like blanking right now, but essentially it's like how peaky your waveform is. So how many spikes are there, you can think of it that way. It's like a peak to average wave ratio pretty much. And you can see it's like, it's not necessarily sausaged out, but it's very well controlled. And you can see dynamic wise where the drop is, where the intro is, and so on and so forth. You can definitely tell that like things are building up here. This is a big section like dynamic wise, and then it drops back out. So it's just kind of a good sanity check, is just to look at the waveform and say, oh, does this make sense? And the other thing is making sure that your peak to average ratio, kind of like how spiky these individual hits are, isn't too much, right? Like if it was, let's see if I can find something to give an example. No, none of those are gonna work. All right, well, I don't really have an example right now, but actually, let's compare these. Maybe I can show. Okay, so here's kind of an example. So one thing you can see is in this section right here. Actually, I zoomed in too much. It's kind of hard to see. Hold on, let me go like this. But you can see like the peaks kind of poke out a little bit more here than they do in these following mixed down versions. That's basically has to do with when this was hitting, I didn't have the sidechain wasn't activated on my earlier versions in the builds. And so actually that was a drop, but I think the sidechain wasn't hitting right. And so the kicks were kind of sitting over, the kicks and the percussion were sitting on top of the track, and they were giving this little bump up. And what that's going to do is when you go into mastering and it hits a limiter, that's just going to mess your limiter up. It's going to act very non-linearly and it's going to sound bad. So what you want is something really controlled, where when your kick hits and your sidechain is done right, everything ducks out of the way and the limiter isn't getting this sudden basically burst of sound. Oh, my bad. The sudden burst of sound that just throws the limiter all out of whack, and now it's like, now it's knocking off 6 dBs of gain reduction instead of 3 or 2 or whatever, right? So you just wanted to have it be as consistent as possible and kind of as acting as linearly as possible against the limiter. So that's what's going on here. So So like I said, I'll bounce these down and then I'll look at the waveforms for problem areas, and I'll go back and listen to it in the mix and say, okay, that's what's happening. I need to fix that. Mixdown 4, this was the one that went to mastering. You can see there's still some, like, it's okay to have a little bit of peaks here and there. That's just some things overlapping. You can't have everything hit perfectly in isolation, but this is pretty good. This is what I more or less wanted my waveform to look like. I get this to a point where I'm like, all right, I like the way the waveform looks. And then I'll open my mastering. So this is what my mastering project normally looks like. I bring it into the bass channel, and then I have multiple stages of mastering, essentially, of compression, EQing, limiting, yada, yada, yada. I've simplified, the way I do my mastering now is a little bit simpler than this, but it's more or less the same workflow. So this is that mixdown that you saw in the last project. I bring it in. I normally will leave a little bit of space or like silence a little bit before and after, and then I almost always will add little fades on the end of the audio files just to make sure that everything fades to null before and at the beginning and at the end of the audio file. First thing is it'll run through what's called the pre-limit stage, and I don't really do this anymore, but it's something I used to do. Is I will basically run it through a transparent limiter and just catch any extra peaks, and it's like 1 to 2 dB max of reduction at the loudest parts. My bad, that was probably hella freaking loud. So let's see how loud that's gonna. All right, we should be good. I'll turn it down just a little bit. All right, so now we're listening to the full mastered version instead of the mixed version. So yeah, like I said, come through here, you'll see that this limiter is not even acting right now. So it's just, you know, pretty transparent settings. It's just catching those peaks, tucking them in just a little bit before I get to the rest of my processing. And it's like a pre-processing type of thing. First thing I'll do, which I don't do much anymore, is I would run the Shadow Hills mastering compressor on it. I like it because it's got optical and discrete compression kind of built in together, which is dope. The optical is like a nice smoothing type of compression. It just kind of like overall gets the volume a little bit louder, a little bit more glued sounding. And then discrete, you can get some more pumping sound out of it if you're looking for that, or get a little bit more punch or bite. I don't really use this much anymore. I actually don't use a whole lot of mastering compression anymore anyways. I do more tape saturation now, but this is what I was doing at this point. And so yeah, there's max 2 dB 3 dB going on here. So this is the optical, 3 dB, 2 dB for the discrete. Okay, and then let's see. Hey Dion, hope glad to have you here. I don't know how long that comment was. Sorry, I didn't have my window up, but just going through the mastering right now. I just started going through the mastering, so we're not really missing anything just yet. Anyways, so that's pretty much it for the Shadow Hills. In terms of release, which they call recover, release and attack settings, I normally set the attack pretty low or pretty long, so that's what I have here. And then the release, I just kind of play with it until it sounds right. A lot of the times I'll set it on dual, just because, which dual means it has the same exact release settings as the optical. The optical and discrete share the same release, which kind of gives it a little bit more of a like unified sound essentially. I didn't do it in this case though. The other thing that I'll do, and this is the main reason I would run this Shadow Hills, is I would run it in dual mono. which means that it affects each, like the left and right channel of the stereo output independently. So it compresses the left channel and compresses the right channel based on what the information is in each channel, not as a single stereo file. And what that does is the compression is going to react a little bit differently on each channel. And it's just going to basically, like, in long story short, it comes out with a bit of a wider sound, like a wider stereo sound. Because the basic way that our ears work is when left and right don't match. Like if the audio material is close but doesn't exactly match, that to us, we perceive that as a widening effect. It sounds wide to us. And so that's what's going on with the dual mono. That's why I really like this plugin. Then I just do some basic low cutting. I usually low cut anywhere around 20 to 30 hertz. Just depends on the song, what key it's in, things like that. And then I'll do some side cutting. This will be anywhere from 100 to 250 hertz. Again, just depends on the song and the style I'm going for. This just kind of frees up a little bit more of that low end, so this sub has some more space to play. I mean, anything really below like 100, 150 hertz, you don't need any side information, just because it's just not useful. Now we go into stage 2. And yeah, so we get into some stuff that now we start getting into some harmonic mixing stuff. So actually, before I get to that, one thing I'll do here, okay, so now what I'll do is actually I'll run it through parallel processing. So I have a parallel channel bus set up, and then in this case I'm running an inflator, so Oxford inflator, which is kind of like a wave shaper, just kind of adds a little bit of apparent loudness, and then as well as some limiting. I do the low latency one since it's in parallel with the original source. And then this is just, let's see. So I'm hitting both these plugins pretty hard. It's capped out. It's got a digital limit on here, so it's kind of like a built-in limiter on the inflator, which to my ear sounds a little bit better than the analog mode that they have for this. The analog mode is if you turn the clip off, it basically has like overtones and stuff that it feeds back into the signal, which sounds good for some stuff, but some material just doesn't sound good on. But in most cases for EDM, I find that the zero clip works better. So that's what I'm doing here. And then this, I'm, limiting by about 2 to 3 dB. So I'm driving this actually pretty hard. The reason why is I drive the parallel channel really hard, and then I mix it back in to the original channel. So try to take this. This is just the parallel channel. And you can hear so it's a little blown out. But what I do is now I hit the full thing and I have the parallel channel fully like muted pretty much. And then I'll start mixing it in. So with it, and then without it. With it. So you can hear how it just adds apparent loudness, essentially. It gives a little bit more beef. And that's what's going on with the parallel. Both these, so the original signal and the parallel signal, then go into what's called stage 3. And this is the final stage that I do for my mastering. And this is kind of like where I do my harmonic distortion as well as the final clipping and things like that. So this guy, which I got from Plugin Alliance, is so dope. It's basically a master, like a mastering grade, like analog clipper and harmonic distortion thing unit. So it sounds really, really good. And there's this setting. It's kind of like a little secret in the mastering community, I found out, but everyone just uses the MS master. It adds a little bit of width to the overall master. Basically just puts it in mid-side mode, or puts the audio in a mid-side matrix, and then it adds second order harmonic distortion to the mid channel. So you have the amount of distortion mix here, and then this is saying that it's on the mid channel. And then it adds a third order harmonic distortion to the side channel, and this is your mix for that. So that's what's going on here. If I were to turn it on and off, so it's very subtle, but it basically just opens. The best way I know how to explain it is just kind of opens the song up. Like it just kind of gives it a little bit more width, but it's like clean width. And it also gives it those extra harmonics. So it just kind of adds a little bit of an analog element to it where things just sound, I don't know, more open. It's hard to really explain other than just saying it sounds more open. So that's, I use that in every single mastering project now. So I love that plugin. Then I run it through my first round of limiting. So I use the 𝖋𝖚𝖓𝖉. I like the modern one a lot. I've actually been using Pro L2 a lot instead of this lately, but this one works really well. So you can see that like this is where I do the true peak limiting. You should at least do at one part or one stage of your mastering process, you should at least do true peak limiting, or at least once, just because if you don't do true peak, you'll have what are called intersample peaking. It's like digital overs essentially. And this is where if you were to if you do it as a WAV file, if you bounce as a WAV file, you're fine. But as soon as you have to convert that to an MP3, or you dither down to a 16-bit from a 24-bit WAV file, these intersample peaking problems are really going to show their face. And this is where you have like clipping and distortion in places that you aren't supposed to have them, even though you didn't have it when you were mastering. So this is just kind of saving you to make sure that you don't have that intersample peaking. It's not perfect, and you still might have, especially depending on how hard you're pushing the limiter, you're still probably going to have some intersample peaks. So, but it does help you a lot. It removes a lot of the intersample peaking. So definitely good to have that at least once. Yeah, taking that out by dB or so. Then this is a trick I learned from some EDM mastering engineer. I can't remember his name. He's really good though, and he does a couple tutorials on YouTube. But there was this one tutorial he had, and if I find it, I'll tell you guys later. But where he does this trick where he'll like heavy-handed limit the track, and then he'll bring back in a gate or an expander essentially to breathe a little bit more life back into it, and then hit it with limiting again. So I've been doing that quite a bit ever since I learned that trick, and it does give a little bit extra life into the track. So at this point, after this limiter, it's squashed, right? Like it's hitting the ceiling and it's not going any further, especially with true peak. Then I send it through this expander, and as you can see, so like I said, it just breathes a little bit more life back into things, and it kind of makes the mastering process sound a bit more musical. It reacts to the dynamics of the track a bit more instead of just pushing up against a brick wall and squeezing the dynamics out of the song. So this is kind of like how you fake those dynamics back into the song, even when you have very like high LUFS mastered stuff. So this is one of those tricks. Then what I'll do is I run it through a big clipper, and that's over here. This is basically just I think it's analog clipping. I think they I think it's modeled after analog clipper. I can't remember, but I like the way it sounds. And clipping versus limiting, it's a little bit different, but in this case I'm actually like hard clipping. I'm not like full on soft clipping, but basically the way that it works is limiting will kind of fold anything that goes over your threshold. It kind of folds it back into the audio file, or you can think of like the waveform folding back in onto itself. With this, it just kind of chops it right off. So this is typically clipping tends to be better for preserving dynamics, or at least perceived dynamics, versus limiting, even though limiting might sound cleaner. So with EDM, especially this style, it's like it's aggressive, so it's okay to sound a little distorted. So you get more apparent loudness, and it sounds sharper when you do clipping instead of just straight up limiting. I do a mix of both, but I like to do the hard clipper in here because it, like I said, it just makes it sound a little bit sharper and gives us that loudness I'm looking for. So basically what I'm doing here is maybe 1.5 dB, max 2 dB of clipping. And then I run it back through another limiter. I'm just touching that, you know, just touching about like 0.6, maybe 0.8 dB reduction at most. At this point, the audio signal is very, very well controlled. So I'm not going to have any peaks that are jumping up and shooting up to like 3 dB of reduction. Like it's going to be very consistent at 0.6. And then the last little bit. So I have a little trick that I like to do in my mastering that I don't see a lot of people do it. I picked it up from Pixel Terror actually, because I was looking at one of their masters, and I saw that, like I was looking at one of the waveforms of their masters, and I saw that they had this kind of jump, like a hard jump between the build and the drop, and it was very interesting to me how they did that. So I like dug around in my mastering project a bit to try and figure it out, and I came up with a process that I do to do essentially the same thing. I learned that trick from them. And the thing that I'm talking about is you can see that this part right here, these parts are actually hard limited. Like there's no peaks going over here, right? But this is the build and this is the drop. Both sections are hard limited. There's no overs. But from the build to the drop, there's actually a jump in level. Well, you can't see it in that case, but if you look here, see how the peaks here are actually, there's a little bit more space than there is on this. It's because in here I actually am peaking at, I think negative 0.2 is what I give for my headroom in my masters, and here I'm peaking at like 0.5, 0.4. And if we look at the meter, I'll show you. Hold up, got it like this. There we go. So 0.3, 0.1. So now I actually do this like 0.4, 0.2. I like to give 0.2 dB headroom, but in this case I did 0.3, 0.1. And it's just like the tiniest little jump. And what it does is like brings back some of those perceived dynamics. Instead of the build sounding almost as loud as, if not even louder than the drop, it's giving me that like increase in peak volume as well as the standard or the perceived loudness. So it just gives even more energy into the drop when that drop hits. And this is something I've been doing for, I guess, over a year now, probably 2 years. And it's the trick that I do to get it. And there's probably a couple of different ways to do it, but I automate. So you'll see in stage 3, I have 2 final limiters. I have this one, which is limiting it at 0.4 dB, right? So my ceiling now, everything is going to hit at 0.4. But I have a gain plug, which is right after that. And down here, this gain plug is at 0 dB, so it's not doing anything. But when the drop hits here, the gain plug shoots up 0.3 dB. So where it was before peaking at 0.4, because that's what my ceiling is, the gain plug is now, with no processing, it's just moving the volume up, is now pushing it up 0.3 dB. So now it's at 0.1. And then I add, just for good safety, I'll add a little, I'll add one more limiter after the gain plug, just to make sure there's no clipping. But it's not really doing anything. And that's essentially what's going on. That's how I'm getting that jump right there. So the basic idea is you hard limit, and then you automate the volume after that hard limit into another limiter. And you can just play around with that. And there's a couple other things that I do here as well. Like I'll limit, or not limit, automate the output gain of the big clipper of my clipping stage, and I'll sometimes automate the mix as well. So it's like these little automation tricks will help bring some of the dynamic and energy into the master. I'm going to peace out, but thanks guys for stopping by. I think I mentioned it in the Discord, but I'm going to be switching it around, so I'll probably do breakdowns on Tuesdays and feedback on Thursdays. But yeah, that's it. Take it easy, guys. Peace.